This is the iPhone 13 Pro, and for those who follow the channel, you'll know that I'm a pretty hardcore Android enthusiast. Now, a lot of people often ask why I prefer Android over iOS, and the truth of it is, whilst it might have initially been because of the extra customization flexibility that Android offered, before too long, it simply came down to the fact that I just preferred Android as an operating system. I prefer things like the quick settings panel or the layout of the home screen, how notifications are handled, plus obviously a heap of little incidentals as well. With that said, about a year ago when I reviewed the iPhone 12, I could tell that iOS was moving in a direction that somewhat appealed to me. Now, at that time, there were still enough features that many Android phones offered over the iPhone lineup, both in terms of hardware and software, that prevented me from making the switch full time. But since then, a lot has changed, and for the first time ever, I've found myself seriously considering whether or not I could start using an iPhone full time. I know, it scares me as much as it might scare you, so let's chat about it. Okay, for context, I'd say there were pretty much four main factors that prevented me from switching to the iPhone 12 full-time last year, and they were the lack of a fast refresh rate display, the entire notification system, the customization flexibility, and finally, the camera system. And what excites me, or perhaps concerns me, is that pretty much each of these issues has been addressed with the 13 Pro lineup. So firstly, the display. For the first time ever on an iPhone device, we finally have a fast refresh rate panel. But keep in mind, this only applies to the 13 Pro and Pro Max, whereas the regular 13 and 13 Mini still have displays locked at 60 Hz. Now, I've always said that because of how Apple optimizes its software to work in conjunction with the hardware, that the difference between an iOS device with a 60 Hz panel and an Android phone with a 120 Hz panel was not as big as it was between an Android phone with a 60 Hz panel and an Android phone with a 120 Hz panel. Does that make sense? So perhaps a little disappointingly, moving to 120 Hz on the 13 Pro hasn't been as big a jump in terms of fluidity as I was initially hoping. But let me stress, that is more so a compliment to Apple's 60 Hz panels than it is a slight on their 120 Hz panels. But essentially what I'm saying is that for the average user, 120 Hz probably isn't worth the extra money on its own if you're tossing up between the 13 or 13 Pro. Now, 120 Hz is still 120 Hz, so it is amazing to have it. And don't get me wrong, I'm still very thankful that Apple has made the switch to 120 Hz for their Pro lineup this year. Everything else about the display is as good or even better compared to last year's lineup as well. They're a significant amount brighter compared to last year's panels, which is always very much appreciated. And as always, the display just feels very responsive and color accurate and is just a true joy to use. So in terms of display, finally, that's not a reason to go Android over iPhone. Touching on the design, and look, overall, it is a very iterative update compared to last year's models, but I did really like the design last year, and so I still really like it this year. In a day and age where most modern phones look and feel pretty similar, it is actually quite unique, which I really like. Comparing it to last year's 12 lineup though, the notch is a little smaller, the camera bump is a little bigger, but both of those changes are pretty hard to notice. I have seen a lot of people saying that the 13 lineup feels a fair bit heftier compared to last year's models, but for me, unless I'm comparing them side by side, the 13 Pro at least doesn't feel that much different in day-to-day use. I will say, personally for me, moving from the regular 12, which had a glossy back, to the 13 Pro, which has a frosted finish on the back, has been amazing. If you're brave enough to rock your phone caseless, then I can assure you it does feel really premium in the hand. But that said, I know a lot of you watching will probably just put the phone in a case, which is probably the wiser option, and so having a frosted or glossy finish probably shouldn't be a deciding factor. Now, unfortunately, because of the increase in size of the camera bump, any cases from last year's models will not fit the newer models. And so if you are in the market for a case to keep your brand new iPhone 13 in mint condition, then I highly recommend picking one up from channel sponsor, Rhino Shield. So I've spoken about Rhino Shield several times on the channel now, and that's because their cases are, to put it simply, some of the best. Not only do their cases provide a really comforting level of protection, but they also offer stacks of customization options on their website. On top of that, their Mod NX system is also available for the new iPhone 13 lineup. And if you haven't heard of Mod NX, it basically allows you to switch up backplates or rim colors, or even the colors of your buttons, which is super cool. Besides customization, their cases also come in a huge variety of finishes and styles, and they've done a bunch of big name collaborations as well, including with PewDiePie, the NBA, plus there's this epic Pac-Man edition, which I really like. Beyond that, the protection you get from using a Rhino Shield case is top shelf. And if you buy one of their impact screen protectors to go with, you're pretty much set. Their cases are available for a huge collection of phones, including a heap of Android phones as well, if that's more your flavor. And what's amazing is that they all come with a lifetime warranty. Rhino Shield also offers free worldwide shipping for qualified orders. Because they're sponsoring this video, they are actually offering 20% off their cases for the next week if you use the code SAM13 at checkout. Or if you're watching this video after that time period, then you can still get a handy 10% off. So make sure that you check out all of their amazing cases and consider picking one up for your own phone using the first link down in the description below. Okay, before we chat about software, I do want to spend a bit of time discussing the cameras. So with the iPhone 13 Pro lineup, we get the full 3 camera setup, a main, an ultra wide, and a 3x telephoto. And each of these cameras has upgraded sensors compared to last year's models. Now, last year, I didn't think the additional 2x telephoto lens was worth the extra money when comparing the regular 12 to the 12 Pro. But this year, I have to say, having the telephoto lens has been really nice. I think being a parent with 2 kids often playing in the distance, the fact that I'm still able to capture some quality photos and videos with this 3x telephoto lens has been really nice. Now, that said, depending on the scenario, even when you've tapped that 3x button, sometimes Apple will actually just use the main lens digitally zoomed in instead because it assumes the quality will be better. And you can even see the change here in this screen recording when I switch from pointing the camera at an object that is really well lit compared to one that it thinks isn't as well lit. But I think it's far too aggressive at making the switch. And even when I quickly snapped a shot here of my mouse before it automatically switched over, I easily prefer the one taken with the actual telephoto lens. I actually reckon this is kind of similar to what happens with the macro functionality and how it switches from the main lens to the ultra wide lens automatically whenever you get close enough to an object. And apparently Apple is going to be releasing a software update that lets users manually trigger the switch instead, but I think they should also address this aggressive automatic switching of the telephoto lens and give us an option to disable that in the settings as well. Aside from that though, I've just found the cameras on this year's lineup to be more fun. You obviously get the image profiles to switch between if you want to dial in a more edited look straight out of the camera, which I think is pretty cool. There's the macro mode, which whilst not something I'll use too often, is still very fun to have. But then the feature that I find really fun is cinematic mode. I know it comes with a lot of limitations and it's copping some flack for essentially being a half-baked feature, but when it gets it right, the footage looks really cool. Some of these videos I've captured of my kids, whilst certainly not perfect, I still think they look really impressive. And it's one of those features I love showing off to people around me. And the thing I'm particularly impressed by is how there's no flickering of the background blur. Once it thinks it's detected the edge, it just locks it in beautifully. And even though some elements might be blurred when they perhaps shouldn't be, if you compare Apple's cinematic mode to any other portrait video mode found on other phones, this one is leagues in front. Now, I still wouldn't be using it for capturing critical videos, but it does have me really excited for what the future holds in regards to this feature. And even right now, I can see myself using it somewhat regularly for capturing videos. Videos captured in normal mode though are still absolutely top shelf. And I just love that we can record at 4K 60 with any of the lenses, which is actually pretty rare to find on the Android side of things. And then even just the stills captured from each of the lenses are really visually impressive as well. And like I said, they're a lot of fun to switch between. Now, is it the best at any one of these lenses? No, I still think Google is up there with how their phones process images from the main lens. Samsung and Xiaomi are probably the best for telephoto images, and even OnePlus is right up there in terms of its ultra-wide images. But I think the iPhone 13 Pro has much more consistent results across each and every lens, which in some ways is more important than having just one lens being the best and then lackluster results from the others. So to put a neat bow on my thoughts on this camera setup on the iPhone 13 Pro, put simply, this is the most fun I've had with a camera system on an iPhone device ever. All right, the last piece of the puzzle we need to talk about is software. No matter how good the hardware might be on any given phone, if the software just simply doesn't appeal to me, then I'm not going to be able to use that phone as my everyday device. And up until now, that has been the number one deterrent that has prevented me from switching to iOS full time. But since reviewing the iPhone 12, a lot has changed in the Android world. For example, it's become increasingly harder to customize an Android phone's home screen without some serious impact on fluidity. And even just the overall OS is starting to feel a little more like iOS. And the surprising side effect of all of these changes is that for me, for the first time ever, the switch from Android to iOS for this review was very seamless. Firstly, in terms of customization, whilst we got to dabble a little with it on iOS 14 last year, it was still very restrictive and more importantly had a huge impact on user experience. Like if you wanted to have customized icons on your home screen, then every time you tapped on one of those icons, it would first open the Shortcuts application, then redirect you to your app of choice. But now, all you get is a little notification banner, and you can even remove that banner with some custom automation settings as well. I covered how to set that up as well as the entire home screen setup you've been seeing throughout this video in a separate in-depth tutorial video. So I'll link that up in the cards and down in the description below. Now you do also lose notification badges, but see, over on Android, to use custom icons on most default Android launches, you also have to use widgets, which also means you lose notification badges. So I've spent about the past year using home screen setups on Android phones that don't show notification badges. And what I didn't realize was happening was that I was subconsciously becoming so accustomed to this that when I switched to iOS, it wasn't an issue not seeing notification badges on my home screen. Look, all that to say, with a little bit of time and effort, I've been able to set up a home screen on my iPhone 13 Pro that suits my style pretty closely, but that more importantly, hasn't really impacted my experience of using the phone. Now, is it perfect? No, we still don't have support for widgets with unlimited touch points, which does make things pretty restrictive. But again, at the very least, I can get a home screen setup looking the way I want it to without much impact on user experience. Now, I also mentioned that the way iOS handles its notifications was another pretty big reason for why I hadn't made the switch full time. Put simply, in the past, I've just missed way too many important notifications because of the flawed notification system on iOS. And for me, it all came down to two main issues. Firstly, the lack of notification icons in the status bar, and secondly, that really annoying issue of notifications disappearing from the lock screen as soon as you unlock your phone. Now, whilst we still don't get notification icons in the status bar, Apple has kind of addressed that second issue. We now have a setting called time-sensitive notifications, and having this setting enabled will essentially keep a notification visible for up to an hour on the lock screen, even after it's been unlocked. And it doesn't sound like a big change, but for me, this has been monumental. I rely on keeping notifications unread until I'm ready to respond to them. And on Android, unless I intentionally swipe a notification away, it will stay on my lock screen, in the status bar, and in the notification panel until I do swipe it away. And so having this new time-sensitive setting for some applications on iOS has been a bit of a game changer. Now, it baffles me that Apple doesn't let you customize how long time-sensitive notifications can stay on the lock screen for. I'd love it if I could change this setting to unlimited. And Apple also decides which apps are allowed to have the toggle as well. And if an app doesn't, well, you're out of luck. So there's still some work to be done, but even what we have now has actually made a world of difference in how I've enjoyed my experience using iOS and the iPhone 13 Pro. Now, is the software flawless? Absolutely not. I wish the app library was less automated and more customizable, and I wish we had a dedicated back gesture like what we have on Android. Oh, and I sorely miss not having an inbuilt always on display, though I will say I have set up a shortcut to launch an app called OLED X, and when I do remember to toggle this, it kind of feels almost as good as having a proper always on display feature, but I do often forget to toggle it, and it's still nothing but a janky workaround. So I really wish Apple would bake this into iOS natively sometime soon. Now, on top of all of this, I do want to quickly give Apple some additional praise for things like battery life, which is honestly next level with this phone. No joke, I'm finishing most days with about 60 to 70% of battery life left, sometimes high 70s. And this is bonkers. On top of that, as always, the haptics are world class, which I just love. The speakers are phenomenal, and the phone performs like straight butter no matter what I throw at it. So with all of that being said, what am I going to do? Well, here's the thing. My full-time job is creating YouTube videos, and a lot of the videos I'm making are phone reviews. So far this year, I've reviewed 12 newly released phones, not including a few revisited phone reviews I've done as well. And whenever I review a phone, I put my one and only SIM card into it and use that phone as my everyday device. I don't have a backup SIM that gets used for reviews, and I certainly don't have a secondary main phone either that I continue to use whilst I'm reviewing another phone. My main phone is whatever phone I'm reviewing at the time. Now, normally I keep my SIM card in a phone until I start reviewing the next one, but last year with my review of the iPhone 12, I couldn't even last that long, and I switched back to using an Android phone as soon as I was done filming the review. But this year, no. I'm more than happy to keep my SIM in this phone until I start reviewing the next one. And to be honest, if I wasn't reviewing so many phones throughout the year, I'd be very open to the idea of using this as my main everyday device, or at least in conjunction with an Android phone. I think I still prefer Android in terms of the OS, and if I'm being completely honest, I just find it funner. And the fact that 80% of my content here on my channel revolves around Android means I'll probably never make the switch to iOS full time. But if you're a long-time Android user on the fence about making the switch to iOS, well, the first time, I'm not gonna try and convince you otherwise. There's still plenty to love about Android, but I think what we're seeing is that the two operating systems are getting closer and closer to the point where transitioning between the two isn't as tricky as it once was. But those are my thoughts. I'm hoping hearing a perspective on the iPhone 13 lineup from a hardcore Android enthusiast has been at the very least a little insightful. But as always, let me know your thoughts on the matter down in the comments below. As well as that, don't forget to check out the incredible Rhino Shield cases using the first link down in the description, and use the code SAM13 at checkout to get 20% off your order for the next week, or 10% after that. Aside from that, hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will catch you later.